What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Wild stories about Ernest Hemingway's truly manly life. Ernest Hemingway was one of those rare writers whose fictional tales of action and adventure seemed to pale in comparison to those he lived in his real life. He wrote about the harrowing battlefields of WWI after having served as an ambulance driver in Italy, and wound up with a body full of shrapnel and bullets. He wrote about bullfighting by watching thousands of matadors square off against the giant beasts. He lived his life to the fullest, loudest, and manliest as often as it would allow. While many of the most infamous stories of his life have been obfuscated through hero worship and constant retelling, there are some undeniable facts from his 61 years of life that are truly epic. From hunting German submarines on his wooden fishing boat, to offering up cash prizes to any man who could knock him out in a boxing match in under 3 rounds, to emptying entire machine gun clips into sharks' heads while fishing for giant tuna, everything Hemingway did went the extra macho mile. Here's a look at some of the biggest, boldest, most dangerous adventures, obsessions, and brushes with mortality Hemingway ever experienced. He was recruited by the precursor to the KGB. When covering the Spanish Civil War in 1937, reporting for the American Newspaper Alliance, Hemingway got passionately involved in the anti-fascist cause supported by the rebels against Francisco Franco's tyrannical regime. At the time, the Soviet Union was the only European power to actively and vocally support the rebels, while Hitler's Germany and the Italy backed Franco strongly. Military historian Nicholas Reynolds discovered, while writing a biography of Hemingway's history with the military, the revered writer had been recruited in 1940 by the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, NKVD, Russia's precursor to the KGB. Hemingway was selected by the organization under the code name Argo, due to his persuasive writing and potential for persuasive propaganda. However, as World War II broke out and America entered the fray, Hemingway left the organization and began work for the OSS, America's precursor to the CIA. During World War I, he saved the fragment of shrapnel that led to his discharge from the army. When World War I broke out, Hemingway volunteered to serve as an ambulance driver in Italy at the age of 18, working with the American Red Cross. While driving a mobile canteen delivering food to soldiers, he was struck by a mortar fired by Austrian forces. There was a flash, as when a blast furnace door is swung open, and a roar that started white and went red, Hemingway recalled of the experience in a letter. Hemingway applied several pieces of shrapnel to his body during the explosion. However, he was shot by machine gun fire as he carried a wounded Italian soldier off the battlefield in spite of his injury. He was awarded a Silver Medal of Valor by the Italian government, but that wasn't the most important memento of his bravery. He also took home the shrapnel that led to his discharge toward the end of World War I. While recuperating in a hospital in Milan, Hemingway met and fell in love with his Red Cross nurse, Agnes von Kurowski, and the experience probably served as the basis for one of his most beloved novels, A Farewell to Arms. He consoled F. Scott Fitzgerald about his manhood. Hemingway and the great Gatsby author F. Scott Fitzgerald were contemporaries, ideological rivals, and very different types of writers. However, in his autobiography A Movable Feast, Hemingway asserts that he not only observed Fitzgerald's manhood, but also attempted to console him over its subpar size. In the book, Hemingway recalls an alleged incident in which Fitzgerald tells him that his wife, fellow author Zelda Fitzgerald, said his member didn't measure up, so to speak. According to Hemingway, Fitzgerald was then instructed to accompany him to a bathroom, where he reportedly observed it for himself out of professional curiosity. Hemingway wrote, "We came back into the room and sat down at the table. 'You're perfectly fine,' I said. 'You are okay. There's nothing wrong with you. You look at yourself from above and you look foreshortened. Go over to the Louvre and look at the people in the statues and then go home and look at yourself in the mirror in profile.'" His way of consoling Fitzgerald was to tell him he's better endowed than unclothed ancient statues, which didn't seem to put Fitzgerald's mind at ease. He survived back-to-back plane crashes. In 1954, the same year Hemingway earned the Nobel Prize for Literature, the author and his fourth wife, Mary Welsh, decided to take a vacation in East Africa and fly on a sightseeing tour that would begin at Murchison Falls on the lower Victoria Nile River. However, on the way to the 400-foot waterfall, their chartered aircraft had to dive to avoid a flock of large African birds known as ibises. As a result, it made an emergency landing in an area that the New York Times referred to as one of the most inaccessible spots in Uganda, dominated by crocodiles, elephants, buffaloes, lions, and other big game. According to Hemingway, the pilot had to choose to land in either a sand pit filled with sun-basking crocodiles or an elephant track. He chose the elephants, which could have been nearly as dangerous. After camping overnight, the group took a tourist steamer boat down the Nile to Butiaba, where they boarded a rescue plane. However, almost immediately after takeoff, the plane crash-landed and caught fire, leaving Hemingway's wife with 2 cracked ribs. They were then rescued again and taken to Entebbe by road. Hemingway reportedly exited the jungle with a bottle of gin and a bunch of bananas, telling reporters, "My luck, she is running very good." He decorated his Florida home with a urinal from his favorite bar. Hemingway's home in Key West, Florida, which was purchased by the novelist in 1931 toward the end of Prohibition, contains all manner of strange ephemera and bizarre tributes to the author's wild life. The one item that is perhaps the most iconic is a particular fountain. Found among the trees in the backyard, it appears to be a decorative adornment and is, in fact, made from a urinal that Hemingway took from his favorite watering hole. According to Hemingway legend, as told by the guides who give tours of his famed property, Hemingway bought the urinal from Joe Russell, owner of Sloppy Joe's Bar, when Russell was forced to move locations due to a rent hike. Hemingway supposedly told Russell that it should be his, considering just how much money he pissed away there. It was also a way to get back at his wife, Pauline Pfeiffer, who'd spent $20,000 on a swimming pool in the backyard while he was away covering the Spanish Civil War. Hemingway had the urinal placed near the pool, so every time Pauline looked out from the balcony on her oasis pool, she'd have to look down on the urinal as well. He held a world record for marlin fishing. Hemingway was a famed hunter, but he was also one of the most celebrated sport fishermen of his day. He was passionate about the nuances of fishing, the mental aspects of the sport, and even the scientific elements of fishing and ichthyology. He worked with 2 scientists to study different species of marlin, and through their study, they redefined the scientific classification for the large fish. He was extremely interested in fishing for big game, including marlin and tuna. In fact, he once caught a massive marlin estimated to be almost 1,000 pounds. His acclaimed novella, The Old Man and the Sea, is said to be based on this incident. He also established a world record when he caught 7 marlin in a single day. He outfitted his own boat to hunt for German submarines. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and sparked America's entrance into World War II, Hemingway didn't immediately travel to Europe or Japan to report, as he had during the Spanish Civil War. Instead, he stayed at his home in Havana, Cuba, and began working with American officials to keep a lookout for Third Reich sympathizers in Cuba. He also took it upon himself to take his fishing boat, Pilar, and outfit it with a small crew armed with machine guns to patrol the Gulf of Mexico to defend it from German submarines. Many people view this year-long effort as an attempt by a middle-aged Hemingway to be as heroic as the characters in his novels. It has frequently been criticized as being almost comical and utterly ineffective. His plan, as described by biographer Terry Mort, was to wait around for a U-boat to stop his vessel, at which point he'd shoot at its hull with a machine gun and try and throw a grenade into the hatch. According to Hemingway's ex-wife Martha Gellhorn, Hemingway typically used his submarine patrols as an excuse to go fishing and drink while claiming to be helping the Allies' efforts. He shot sharks and one time himself with a gun from his boat. One of the major problems with fishing for large catches, such as marlin and tuna, is that as you drag the several hundred-pound fish back to shore to tire it out, it gets slowly but surely eaten, one chunk at a time, by sharks. Hemingway had a method of dealing with sharks, shooting them with his submachine gun before they could eat the big fish he caught. Occasionally, this actually resulted in the blood attracting even more sharks. The outcomes were worse at other times. Once while Hemingway was out fishing, he and a friend each caught 2 medium-sized sharks. As they desperately wrangled them, Hemingway took a .22 pistol and fired into the shark's head. It continued to thrash as he tried to gaff it with a hook in his other hand. Suddenly, the handle on the gaff broke and somehow hit his gun hand, and the pistol went off. In one action, Hemingway managed to accidentally shoot himself through both calves. "Well, I'll be of unsavory parentage," Hemingway claims to have said at the time. "I've been killed." He also said there was no pain or discomfort, only a small hole about 3 inches below the kneecap and another ragged hole bigger than your thumb. He then asked a crewmate for iodine, some bread to eat and later a drink. Hemingway would go drinking with James Joyce and finish fights Joyce started. During his life, Hemingway had some rather contentious relationships with many of his literary contemporaries, including F. Scott Fitzgerald, T.S. Eliot, Wallace Stevens and others, to name a few. However, ironically enough, the hypermanly Hemingway made a close friend in the Irish poet and novelist James Joyce. Joyce was a small, quiet man, and Hemingway and Joyce would go from pub to pub and appear to start fights. In 1961, Hemingway's obituary in the New York Times stated, "Mr. Joyce and Mr. Hemingway and his partner consumed some alcohol together." The author of Ulysses was a man who couldn't see well and was thin, wispy, and had no muscle. When they were making the rounds of the cafes and Mr. Joyce became embroiled with a brawler, as he frequently did, he would slip behind his hefty companion and cry, "Deal with him, Hemingway. Deal with him." He once slapped a literary critic in the face with a critic's own book. Occasionally, Hemingway's writing was criticized for romanticizing excessive masculinity. When it came to critic Max Eastman, who had once been friends with Hemingway and was also 12 years his elder, the critic jokingly said Hemingway's book about bullfighting, Death in the Afternoon, was an attempt by the novelist to prove how manly he was, when in reality he was generally a soft-hearted, delicate man. "Come out from behind that false hair on your chest, Ernest. We all know you," Eastman wrote. This was interpreted by Hemingway as an attack on his sexuality, or possibly as a suggestion that he was unable to conceive. After Eastman's critique was published, Hemingway visited his publisher, Max Perkins, at his office in New York. Eastman happened to be there as well, as they both worked with Perkins. Hemingway is said to have asked if his chest was sufficiently hairy after ripping open his shirt. Hemingway smacked Eastman in the face with the book containing his critical essay after hearing him laugh. Eastman and Hemingway tussled a bit and were eventually pulled off each other. Eastman then began telling people he'd beaten Hemingway in a fist fight, and that he threw him over a table and stomped on his head. The furious novelist responded to Eastman's boasts by proposing an offer in a New York Times article. If Mr. Eastman takes his prowess seriously, if he has not, as it seems, gone in for fiction, then let him waive all medical rights and legal claims to damages, and I'll put up $1,000 for any charity he favors or for himself. Then we'll go into a room and he can read his book to me, the part of his book about me. Well, the best man unlocks the door. He favored cats with 6 toes. Hemingway was a big game hunter, a shark killer, a sport fisherman, and a fan of bullfighting. He had a soft spot in his heart for cats, despite a track record that would suggest a love for killing animals. Specifically odd, deformed ones known as polydactyl cats, which possessed extra fingers and toes on their paws. Hemingway received his first 6-toed cat, named Snow White, from a sea captain named Stanley Dexter, who kept it on board because he believed polydactyl cats were a source of good luck. Hemingway fell in love with Snow White and polydactyl cats in general, devoting a large portion of his famous home in Key West to his pets, and named many of his cats after famous people. Even when he liked pets, it was in a weird, unusual way that allowed him to stand out from everyone else. To this day, the descendants of the Snow White roam the gardens of the Hemingway house. There are dozens of cats, half of which have the gene and are polydactyls. Polydactyl cats are now generally referred to as Hemingway cats. He attempted to spar with a heavyweight champion while constructing a boxing ring in his backyard. Hemingway was absolutely obsessed with pugilism and becoming a world-class boxer. From the time he was a young man, it was a passion that drove him almost as much as writing and shooting things. A boxing ring was one of the first things he built in the backyard of his Key West, Florida home when he bought it. Here he could spar, challenge others to fights, and celebrate the sport he loved. In his mid-30s, Hemingway had polished his skills as an amateur boxer and went to Bimini in the Bahamas to put his talents to the test. He put everyone to the test and offered $250 to any man who could defeat him in 3 rounds or less. The challenge was accepted by 4 distinct local fighters, all of whom were defeated. Having said that, Hemingway probably had a right to be more boastful about his abilities than he was. He was certainly capable of competing against fellow amateurs in a ring or bar brawl, but his age and physique prevented it from becoming a reality. That didn't stop him from issuing an invite to heavyweight champ and Boxing Hall of Famer Jack Dempsey to spar with him in the ring, an offer that was rejected. Dempsey later recalled, "I had this sense that Hemingway, who really thought he could box, would come out of the corner like a madman. To stop him, I would have to hurt him badly. I didn't want to harm Hemingway in that way. That's why I never sparred with him." Hemingway watched thousands of bullfights before writing his seminal book on the event. One of the most important and influential books about bullfighting was Hemingway's Death in the Afternoon, a non-fiction examination of the Spanish sport and its accompanying rituals and traditions. One of the most in-depth works on bullfighting at the time, it examines the singular contrast between courage and fear as well as the nature of death. To get such a nuanced look at the sport, it required Hemingway to go to many events. Before he ever started writing, the author himself claims that he witnessed the slaughter of more than 1,500 bulls by matadors. He became a regular at bullfighting rings all over Spain while researching the sport and taking in the sights and sounds of the sport. He also became close friends with many of the greatest matadors of the time. Bullfighting is the only art in which the artist is in danger of perishing, and in which the degree of brilliance in the performance is left to the fighter's honor. Hemingway wrote of the sport with a mix of adoration and reverence. He appreciated the sport, but he disagreed with many people who were outraged by its existence and inherent cruelty. For him, it was no different than hunting and exemplified the dominance of man over nature and his surroundings. He had a giant scar on his face from a bathroom accident. After being shot by enemy fire, peppered with shrapnel, attacked by wild animals, shot accidentally by himself, punched repeatedly in the boxing ring and in bar brawls, injured in double plane crashes, and all manner of other life-threatening run-ins and altercations, the most prominent and painful-looking scar Hemingway had came from a drunken accident in a Paris bathroom. Hemingway proceeded to aggressively yank on a metal chain that he thought was the toilet flush chain but was actually attached to a metal skylight after using the bathroom. Hemingway pulled so hard, he caused the entire fixture to come crashing down on his head, leading to a massive gash that required 9 stitches and led to a possible concussion. This was only one of many injuries Hemingway suffered in his lifetime, including 2 he endured during car accidents and another during a small plane crash in Africa. However, it was the Parisian bathroom incident that reportedly left the most visible scar across his face. Ernest Hemingway was not just a novelist. He was a full-throttle, whiskey-soaked, fist-swinging force of nature who seemed hell-bent on stuffing a dozen lifetimes into his 61 years on Earth, and he mostly succeeded. While many writers live vicariously through their characters, Hemingway seemed to craft characters who could barely keep up with him. Before he was 20, he'd already volunteered for the Red Cross in World War I, was blown up by a mortar, hit by machine gun fire while carrying an injured comrade, fell in love with a nurse in Milan, and wrote about it all in a novel that turned heartbreak into art. He saved the piece of shrapnel that ended his military service like a war trophy, a tangible memento of a life that didn't just brush with death but invited it over for a drink. His travels weren't just sightseeing trips, they were life-or-death odysseys, often culminating in blood, bullets, or both. During the Spanish Civil War, while most correspondents stuck to the safety of hotels and telegrams, Hemingway embedded himself in the trenches, wrote from the front lines, and even found time to get recruited by the Soviet Union's precursor to the KGB, the NKVD. Dubbed Argo, his code name was lifted straight from mythology, as if even his espionage life needed an epic flair. But Hemingway didn't remain a Soviet agent for long. As World War II approached, he switched allegiances, working with the American OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, proving that when he wasn't fighting, writing, or drinking, he was still somehow involved in international cloak and dagger escapades. During the same war, Hemingway used his fishing boat to patrol the waters off Cuba. Armed to the teeth, he allegedly used grenades, Tommy guns, and anything else he could find to hunt down German U-boats. The image of Papa Hemingway charging at Nazi submarines like Captain Ahab with an M1 carbine in one hand and a daiquiri in the other was too perfect to resist, despite the fact that no one really believed he would take down a submarine with a wooden boat and a few hand grenades. The man even turned his Florida home into a living monument to his own eccentricity, when his wife built an extravagant $20,000 swimming pool without consulting him, an astronomical sum in the Depression era. He responded by installing a urinal from Sloppy Joe's, his favorite bar, right next to it, just to remind her who the real king of the castle was. In addition, Hemingway once joked that he had spent more money at Sloppy Joe's than he had ever earned writing novels. Later, the bar held an annual look-alike contest in his honor, which still attracts thousands of Papa-like wannabes with beards and sunburns from all over the world. Hemingway's obsession with